The laughter hit her first, sharp, echoing, cruel enough to feel physical. It bounced off the towering stone pillars of the great hall and settled like dust over the gathered alphas, each one draped in power, pride, and barely disguised contempt. She stood in the center of it, alone, exposed, the weight of 100 judging eyes pressing against her skin. The air smelled faintly of iron and smoke, of old victories and older blood, and somewhere in the distance a fire cracked in a massive hearth as if amused by her humiliation. She didn't bow. That was the problem. That was always the problem. "You were given a command," one of them sneered, his voice thick with dominance, the kind that came from generations of unquestioned authority. He lounged in his seat like a king in his own right, fingers drumming lazily against the carved armrest. Or did you not understand the language? More laughter rippled through the hall, low, mocking, predatory. She could feel it crawling over her skin, trying to get inside her head, trying to make her smaller, weaker, easier to break. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, nails pressing into her palms just enough to ground her. Pain helped. Pain reminded her why she was here. "I understood," she said, her voice steady despite the storm building beneath her ribs. It wasn't loud, but it carried. It always carried. That only made them laugh harder. "Then why?" Another voice cut in, sharper, colder. "Are you still standing?" That one came from the right side of the hall, where a cluster of high-ranking alphas watched her like she was some curious animal brought in for sport. Their eyes gleamed with interest and disdain in equal measure. One of them leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, studying her with a predator's patience. "Or do you think you're above tradition?" The word tradition was spat like a weapon. A rule, a chain. Bow. Submit. Survive. That was how it worked here. That was how it had always worked. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough for the tension to twist tighter in the air. Her heart was beating fast now, too fast, but she refused to let it show. "No," she said finally. "I just don't kneel to men who haven't earned it." The reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her. A low growl from one of the alphas to her left. Chairs shifted. The air thickened, heavy with the sudden, volatile shift in mood. And then, explosive laughter. Louder this time. Wilder. As if she had just delivered the most entertaining joke they'd heard all year. "Did you hear that?" Someone barked, slapping his hand against the armrest. "She doesn't kneel." "To men who haven't earned it," another repeated, mockingly reverent. "Careful," a third voice added with a grin that showed too many teeth. "You might actually start believing you're something special." She said nothing. Silence was safer now. Silence was control. But inside, her thoughts were racing. This was worse than she expected. The hostility, the arrogance, the sheer hunger for dominance. It was all sharper, more immediate, more dangerous. They weren't just testing her. They were looking for a reason to put her down, permanently. And she had just handed them one. "Enough!" the first alpha snapped, and though there was still amusement dancing in his eyes. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers with sudden intensity. "You've had your moment. Now kneel." The command dropped into the room like a stone into deep water, sending invisible ripples through every corner of the hall. This was it. The line. Cross it, and she lived. At least for now. Refuse, and... Her throat tightened, just for a second. Just long enough for doubt to whisper. Just long enough for fear to try and take root. This wasn't just pride. This wasn't just defiance. This was survival. Every instinct screamed at her to lower herself, to play the part, to disappear until she could figure out her next move. That's what she was trained to do. blend in, adapt, endure. But there was another voice, quieter, sharper, buried deeper. The one that had gotten her this far, and the one that refused to be broken. If you kneel now, you don't just survive, you surrender. And once you surrender, you don't get yourself back. The hall seemed to close in around her, the pressure building, tightening, waiting. All eyes were on her now, watching, anticipating, enjoying. She could feel their expectations like hands pushing her down. For a split second, she imagined it, her knees hitting the cold stone floor, her head lowering, her voice soft with submission. The laughter would fade, the tension would ease, she would become just another face in the crowd. Safe, invisible, forgotten. And her mission would continue. But something in her chest twisted at the thought. Something fierce and unyielding. No. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened her spine even more, lifting her chin just enough to make her answer unmistakable. No. The word was quiet, but it landed like thunder. The reaction was instant. Chairs scraped back. A growl tore through the hall, low and dangerous, vibrating in the air like a warning before a storm. One of the alphas stood, his aura flaring, raw power pressing outward in a wave that made the torches flicker. "You dare," he started, his voice laced with fury. "Enough." The single word cut through everything. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was calm, controlled, absolute. And it came from the one place no one had looked. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised platform that overlooked everything, the Alpha King rose to his feet. The effect was immediate. Silence slammed into the room so hard it felt like the air had been sucked out entirely. Even the fire seemed to quiet, its crackling reduced to a faint whisper. Every alpha, every noble, every servant froze, heads bowed, not in mockery, but in instinct, in respect, in fear. She felt it too, that shift, that undeniable pull of authority that radiated from him like gravity itself. It pressed against her, testing her, measuring her in a way that was entirely different from the others. Where their dominance had been loud, aggressive, desperate to prove itself, his was effortless, absolute, unquestioned. Slowly, as if moving through something thick and heavy, she turned her head to look at him. And for the first time since she entered the hall, uncertainty flickered in her chest. He didn't look amused. He didn't look angry either. If anything, his expression was curious, intense. Like he was looking at a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. His gaze locked onto hers. I and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. It wasn't just attention, it was scrutiny. Deep, unsettling. As if he could see through every layer she had carefully built around herself. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The tension stretched, sharp and electric, pulling everyone in the room into its orbit. Then, slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King took a step forward. The sound of his boots against the stone floor echoed louder than it should have, each step measured, controlled, impossible to ignore. He descended from the platform, moving through the hall with a quiet authority that parted the crowd without a word. No one dared to stand in his way. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. She held her ground as he approached, though every instinct was screaming at her now. This was different. And this wasn't mockery. This wasn't a test she could outlast with stubbornness and silence. This was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. He stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the way his eyes, dark, sharp, unreadable, studied her without hesitation. Close enough that the weight of his presence felt almost physical. The hall waited. The alphas who had been laughing moments ago were silent now. their earlier arrogance replaced with something closer to unease. Anticipation, because whatever happened next would matter. He tilted his head slightly as if considering her from a different angle. Then, finally, he spoke. "You refused to kneel." It wasn't a question, it was an observation. She swallowed just once before answering. "Yes." Another pause. In another shift in the air. And then, something unexpected. The corner of his mouth lifted, not into a smile, not quite. More like the beginning of one, or the memory of one. "Interesting," he said softly. The word sent a ripple through the room. Confusion, shock, disbelief. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He stepped closer. Just one step. But it was enough to close the distance between them almost entirely. Enough that she could feel the heat of him, the quiet, contained power that radiated beneath the surface. His gaze dropped briefly, taking in the way she stood, the tension in her shoulders, the defiance she hadn't bothered to hide. Then it returned to her eyes, sharper now, more focused. "Tell me," he continued, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear, but somehow still carrying through the hall. "Is it courage or ignorance?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Around them, the court held its breath, waiting, watching. Because this wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, a test far more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. She could feel it. The weight of it. The consequences of whatever answer she chose. For a split second, the safe response flashed through her mind. Something careful, diplomatic, something that would ease the tension without completely surrendering. But she pushed it aside. That wasn't why she was here. That wasn't who she was. Her gaze didn't waver as she met his. "Maybe it's neither," she said quietly. "Maybe I just know the difference between respect and fear." A collective inhale swept through the hall. Someone shifted behind her. Another alpha let out a low, disbelieving sound, but she didn't look away. Couldn't. Not now. Not when everything hinged on this moment. The Alpha King's expression didn't change immediately, but something in his eyes did. Something that flickered to life, sharp and dangerous and intrigued. Then, slowly, he straightened. The faint, almost smile faded, replaced by something colder, more calculating. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the gathered alphas, who immediately lowered their eyes, their earlier confidence nowhere to be seen. "You mock her," he said, his tone calm but carrying an edge that made even the strongest among them tense. "And yet, none of you noticed." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confused, uneasy. He looked back at her, and this time there was no mistaking it. The interest, the recognition, and the something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "She walked into a hall full of predators," he continued, his voice steady, deliberate. "And not one of you could make her bow." Silence. Heavy. Absolute. The shift in power was subtle, but undeniable. And suddenly, she wasn't the only one being judged. He held her gaze for one more moment, as if committing something to memory. Then, just as quietly as he had stepped forward, he turned away. "This is not over," he said, almost to himself. But she heard it. She felt it. And something told her it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The hall remained silent long after he returned to his place, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a storm that hadn't quite broken yet. She stood where she was, heart still racing, mind already spinning ahead. And because everything had just changed, the mission, the danger, the game itself. And at the center of it all was him. Now let me ask you, if you were in her place, surrounded by power, mocked, and one wrong move could cost you everything. Would you have knelt, or would you have risked it all like she did? Drop your answer below, because what you choose might say more about you than you think. The silence that followed did not feel like relief. It felt like a warning. It clung to her as she was escorted out of the great hall, not roughly, not kindly either, but with a careful distance that spoke volumes. No one touched her. Not after that moment. Not after him. The guards who walked beside her kept their eyes forward, their expressions carved from stone, yet their awareness of her was unmistakable. She could feel it in the slight tension of their shoulders, the way their steps adjusted unconsciously to match hers, as if unsure whether she was a guest or a threat. The heavy doors of the hall closed behind her with a deep, echoing thud that seemed to seal something in place, something she couldn't quite name yet. Inside, the game had changed. Outside, it had only just begun. She didn't speak as they led her down a long corridor lined with high-arched windows, each one spilling pale light across the polished stone floor. The palace was even more imposing from within, less like a home, and more like a fortress built to intimidate, to remind anyone who walked its halls exactly who held power here. Banners bearing the royal crest hung from the walls, their deep crimson fabric stirring slightly in the draught, keen like silent witnesses to everything that had just happened. She kept her gaze steady, her pace measured, but inside her thoughts were moving fast, sharp, calculating. She had been trained for situations like this. Not this exact one. Nothing could have prepared her for that encounter. But for the aftermath. For the moment when everything went wrong, when attention shifted, when survival depended not on strength, but on control. And control was something she refused to lose. They stopped in front of a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. One of the guards pushed them open without a word, gesturing for her to enter. She did. The room beyond was smaller, quieter, but no less carefully designed. A chamber meant for temporary guests, or perhaps monitored ones. A single window overlooked the inner courtyard, its iron latticework casting long shadows across the floor. A bed stood against one wall, neatly made, untouched. A table and chair occupied the center of the room, and in the far corner, a basin of water reflected the light like a still mirror. It was simple, controlled, contained. The door closed behind her with a soft click. And just like that, she was alone. For the first time since stepping into the great hall, she allowed herself to breathe. Not deeply, never deeply, but enough to let the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. Her hands flexed at her sides, fingers uncurling slowly, the faint crescent marks from her nails still visible against her palms. She moved to the center of the room, her steps quiet, deliberate, every sense still alert despite the apparent calm. Because this was not safety. This was observation. They were watching her. She didn't need to see the guards stationed outside the door to know that. She didn't need to search for hidden eyes in the walls to understand that nothing here was truly private. That was the first rule she had learned. You are always being watched. The second rule followed closely behind. Act accordingly. She crossed to the window, her gaze dropping to the courtyard below. From this height she could see movement, servants carrying trays, soldiers patrolling the perimeter, a pair of nobles engaged in quiet conversation near a fountain carved from pale stone. Everything looked normal, ordered, controlled. But she knew better. Beneath that surface was something else, something hidden, something dangerous, and she was here to find it. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass, superimposed over the scene beyond. For a moment she studied it, not out of vanity, but necessity. Every detail mattered. The way she held herself, the tension in her jaw, the sharpness in her eyes that she needed to dull just enough to avoid suspicion. She reached up, adjusting a loose strand of her hair, smoothing it back into place with practiced ease. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her, pulled her back into the role she had chosen, the role she had to maintain. Because the girl they saw in that hall, the one who refused to kneel, who spoke out of turn, who stood alone against a room full of alphas, that wasn't supposed to exist. Not here. Not now. She wasn't supposed to stand out. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. And yet, she closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. The Alpha King. Even thinking about him sent a ripple of unease through her carefully controlled thoughts. His reaction had been wrong, not in a way she could immediately define, but wrong enough to matter. He hadn't punished her. He hadn't dismissed her either. He had seen her. And that was a problem, because she had spent years learning how to remain unseen. Her name, her real name, wasn't something spoken lightly. Not in the circles she had come from, not in the world she had been trained to navigate. Names had power. Identities even more so. Here, she was no one. Just another outsider brought into a place she didn't belong. That was the story. That was the mask. But beneath it, she moved away from the window, her steps carrying her toward the table at the center of the room. Her fingers brushed against its surface lightly, feeling for imperfections, for signs of use, for anything that might hint at what this room had been used for before her arrival. There was nothing obvious. Of course there wasn't. Places like this didn't leave traces unless they wanted to. Her gaze shifted to the basin of water in the corner. Slowly, she approached it, crouching slightly as she dipped her fingers into the cool surface. The ripples distorted her reflection, breaking it apart, reshaping it into something unfamiliar. She watched it for a moment, thoughtful, then withdrew her hand, letting the water settle back into stillness. Control. That was what this came down to. Not strength, not defiance. Control over what she revealed. Control over what she concealed. And right now, she had already revealed too much. She straightened, turning back toward the center of the room. Her mind moved through possibilities, adjusting, recalibrating. The mission hadn't changed, but the way she would have to execute it had. Originally, it had been simple. Enter the territory under the guise of a low-ranking outsider. Blend in. Observe. Gather information about the rumors that had been circulating for months now. Whispers of something hidden within the alpha hierarchy. Something powerful enough to shift the balance of control across the entire region. She had been chosen for this because she was good at disappearing, because she understood how power worked, how it moved, how it revealed itself in subtle ways to those who knew where to look. She was supposed to slip through unnoticed, collect what she needed, and leave before anyone realized what had happened. That was the plan, but plans didn't account for him. And the Alpha King was not supposed to notice her. He was not supposed to intervene. He was certainly not supposed to look at her like he had, as if he had already begun to piece together something she had worked very hard to keep hidden. That changed everything, because if he was paying attention, others would follow. And attention was the one thing she could not afford. A soft sound at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Not a knock. Not quite. More like a shift in weight, a subtle indication that someone was there, watching, waiting. She didn't move toward it, didn't acknowledge it directly. Instead, she let her posture relax just slightly, enough to appear less guarded, less alert. A performance. Always a performance. Seconds passed. Then, quietly, the sound faded. Whoever had been there moved away. She remained still for a moment longer before allowing the tension to return to her stance. Testing. They were testing her, measuring her reactions, her behavior, looking for inconsistencies. She expected that. She welcomed it even. because every test gave her information in return, and information was power. She crossed back to the table, pulling the chair out just enough to sit. Slowly, calmly, as if she had nowhere else to be, nothing else to worry about. Inside, her thoughts were still moving, still shifting, still adapting to the new reality she found herself in. The mission was no longer just about uncovering a hidden truth. It was about navigating a space where every move she made could draw the attention of the most powerful figure in the territory. A figure who, for reasons she did not yet understand, he had already taken an interest in her. An interest from someone like him was not something you ignored. It was something you survived. Carefully. Strategically. She leaned back slightly in the chair, her gaze drifting once more to the window, to the courtyard beyond. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But she knew better. Something had shifted the moment he spoke, the moment he chose not to let her fall. And that shift? It was only the beginning. By the time they came for her, the palace had already decided what she was: an anomaly to be tested, a curiosity to be entertained, and perhaps, if she proved inconvenient enough, a problem to be erased. The knock at her door was soft but deliberate, followed by the slow turn of the handle that made it clear this was not a request. She was expected. No, she was being summoned. She rose without hesitation, every movement measured, every expression carefully neutral. The girl who had stood defiant in the great hall could not vanish entirely. That would raise suspicion, but neither could she remain too sharp, too unyielding. Tonight required something else. A quieter kind of strength, a different kind of control. The door opened to reveal a servant this time, not a guard, though the difference was mostly in appearance. The man bowed slightly, avoiding direct eye contact, his posture rigid with the kind of discipline that came from living under constant scrutiny. "You are to attend the evening gathering," he said, his tone formal, devoid of curiosity. "The court expects your presence." Of course they did. She inclined her head just enough to acknowledge the instruction, stepping forward into the corridor without another word. The walk through the palace felt different now. The same walls, the same banners, the same quiet efficiency. But the air had changed. Conversations dipped as she passed. Eyes followed her, some openly, others from behind carefully maintained composure. She had crossed an invisible line in that hall, and there was no stepping back from it. By the time she reached the entrance to the gathering, the sound reached her first. Low music, the murmur of voices layered with laughter that carried a sharper edge than it had earlier. This was not the formal court. This was something more fluid, more dangerous. The doors opened, and she stepped into a world designed to conceal its claws behind elegance. The room was vast, lit by chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow over polished floors and richly dressed figures. Nobles and alphas moved through the space with practiced ease, their interactions a dance of power and politeness, each gesture calculated, each smile carrying more meaning than it revealed. Servants wove between them, silent and efficient, offering drinks, adjusting details, maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury. But beneath it all, tension coiled. She could feel it immediately. It wasn't loud like the confrontation in the great hall. It was subtle, threaded through glances that lingered a second too long, conversations that paused when certain names were mentioned, the slight tightening of shoulders when someone new approached. This was where power was negotiated without being declared, where alliances were tested, strengthened, or quietly dismantled. And tonight, she was part of that equation. She moved into the room with deliberate calm, her steps unhurried, her gaze steady but not challenging. She let herself blend just enough to observe without appearing to hide. But it didn't take long for the first approach. "Well," A voice drawled from her left, smooth but edged with amusement. If it isn't our bold little spectacle from earlier? She turned slightly, her expression composed as she faced the speaker. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark fabric that emphasized the sharpness of his features. His eyes held a glint of interest that was anything but friendly. "I was wondering if you'd be invited," he continued, lifting a glass to his lips. "Or if they'd decided to correct your behavior before allowing you near the rest of us again." There it was, the test. Not direct aggression, but a probe. A way to see how she would respond now that the initial shock had passed. She met his gaze briefly, then let it drift just enough to signal a lack of concern. "I suppose they decided I was more entertaining this way," she said, her tone even. A faint smirk touched his mouth. "Entertaining," he repeated. "Is that what you think you are?" "Isn't that what all of this is?" she replied lightly, gesturing subtly to the room around them. "A performance?" For a moment something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by something more guarded. "Careful," he said softly, leaning in just enough that his words wouldn't carry beyond them. "It's one thing to amuse, it's another to attract the wrong kind of attention." Her gaze sharpened slightly at that, though she kept her expression unchanged. "And which kind is that?" He studied her for a beat longer than necessary, as if weighing whether she was worth the answer. "The kind that doesn't let go once it notices you," he said finally, his voice low. "The kind that decides what you are, before you even understand the game you're playing." A subtle warning, or a threat. Possibly both. Before she could respond, he straightened, his attention shifting past her shoulder. She didn't need to turn immediately to know why. The room had changed. Again. Conversations slowed. Movements adjusted. The invisible currents of power shifted, pulling everything toward a single point. Slowly, she turned. The Alpha King had entered. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence moved through the room like a silent command, drawing attention without effort, altering the atmosphere in a way that no one could ignore. He was dressed simply compared to the others, but there was nothing understated about him. Authority clung to him, undeniable, unchallenged. And just like before, his gaze found her almost immediately. It wasn't obvious, not to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but she felt it. The same intensity, the same unsettling focus that made it clear this was not coincidence. He approached slowly, acknowledging others with brief nods, exchanging a few quiet words here and there, maintaining the balance expected of someone in his position. But the distance between them closed with each step, deliberate or not. The Alpha beside her exhaled quietly. "There it is," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Told you." Then, louder, with a polite incline of his head, "Your Majesty." She didn't bow. Not fully, but she lowered her head just enough to acknowledge the shift in hierarchy without repeating the defiance of earlier. A calculated compromise. The Alpha King's attention moved briefly to the man beside her, then returned to her with that same unreadable expression. "You seem to be adjusting," he said, his tone neutral, but carrying an undercurrent she couldn't quite define. "I learn quickly," she replied. A pause. Not long, just enough to let the words settle. "So I've noticed." The exchange was simple on the surface, but the tension beneath it was anything but. Around them, others pretended not to listen, their conversations continuing with forced ease, but she could feel the focus, the quiet attention directed their way. This was no longer just about her, and it was about what his interest meant, and what it might lead to. "Tell me," he continued, his gaze steady, "do you always make a habit of disrupting traditions when you first arrive somewhere new?" A faint hint of something, almost amusement, touched his voice. She met his gaze evenly. Only when the traditions seem outdated. A dangerous answer. Deliberately so. The alpha beside her stiffened slightly, as if expecting a sharper reaction. But the Alpha King didn't respond the way anyone anticipated. Instead, that faint, almost smile returned, brief and controlled. Interesting perspective, he said. You may find that not all traditions are as rigid as they appear. Before she could respond, another figure approached, inserting himself into the conversation with practiced ease. Your Majesty, he said smoothly, his tone respectful, but carrying a subtle edge of familiarity. We were just discussing the upcoming council meeting. There are concerns that may require your attention. The interruption was polite, timed, intentional. The Alpha King's attention shifted, but not entirely. He held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer before turning to address the newcomer. We'll discuss it later, he said. Not a dismissal, not quite, but enough to end the moment. As he moved away, the space around her seemed to exhale. Conversations resumed with slightly more volume. Movements became less restrained. But the undercurrent remained. Stronger now. More focused. The alpha beside her let out a quiet breath. You really don't understand what you're doing, do you? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a glass from a passing tray, her movements unhurried, controlled. Then maybe you should explain it, she said finally. He studied her for a moment, then shook his head slightly. No, he said. I think it'll be more interesting to watch you figure it out. With that, he stepped away, leaving her alone once more in the shifting currents of the room. But she wasn't truly alone. Not anymore. Because now she could feel it clearly. The attention, the interest, the subtle alignment of forces that had begun to move around her. And beneath it all, something else. Something quieter. Something hidden. Conversations she couldn't quite hear but could sense the weight of. Glances exchanged between certain individuals that lasted just a fraction too long. A tension that didn't belong to simple court politics. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a stage. And every person in it was playing a role. The question was, which of them were acting, and which of them were hiding something far more dangerous beneath the surface? She took a slow sip from her glass, her gaze drifting across the room, cataloging, observing, piecing together the fragments of something she couldn't yet fully see. The mission hadn't just become more complicated, it had become something else entirely. Because whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about power, it was about control. And control, she knew, was never as stable as it appeared. The palace did not sleep. It only changed its face. By the time the corridors had fallen into their quieter rhythm and the last echoes of courtly laughter had dissolved into distant stone, she had already learned one important truth. Silence here was never empty. It was watched, measured, used. She waited until the shift in guards outside her chamber became predictable, until the footsteps in the hall beyond her door followed a pattern that repeated just often enough to feel natural. Then she moved, not hurried, not hesitant, controlled. That was the only way to survive places like this, never letting even the walls believe you were uncertain. The door opened with the softest pressure of her fingers, a sound so small it barely existed. The corridor beyond was dimmer now, lit by space torches that flickered like tired eyes. Shadows stretched across the stone floor in long, uneven shapes, bending and shifting with every draft of air that moved through the ancient structure. She stepped out, closing the door behind her with deliberate care, and immediately became something else entirely. Not a guest. Not an outsider. A ghost. Her footsteps made no sound as she moved, her presence dissolving into the architecture of the palace itself. She had memorized parts of the layout already, not from maps, not from guides, but from observation. The way servants turned at intersections, the way guards avoided certain corridors, the subtle differences in airflow that hinted at hidden spaces and unused passageways. Tonight, she followed those instincts. The palace was too large to patrol completely in one pattern. That was its first flaw. Even power, when stretched wide enough, developed blind spots. She reached a junction where 3 corridors met beneath a high vaulted ceiling. To her left, the path led back toward the guest quarters. To her right, toward administrative wings she had not yet been allowed to enter. But straight ahead was different. Fewer torches, less movement. A corridor that felt older somehow, as if it had been forgotten by those who now controlled the palace. That was the direction she chose. The air changed as she walked. Subtle at first. A slight drop in temperature. A dryness that clung to the throat. A faint scent of old stone and something metallic beneath it. The kind of scent that didn't belong to daily life. The kind that belonged to sealed places. Restricted places. Her pace slowed slightly, not out of fear, but calculation. Every instinct she had told her she was approaching something important. Something hidden. And in places like this, importance was rarely harmless. The corridor narrowed, in the walls pressing in closer as if the palace itself was guiding her forward or trying to discourage her from continuing. The torchlight here was weaker, the flames smaller, more reluctant. At one point she noticed something carved faintly into the stone wall, a marking too subtle to be decorative, too precise to be accidental. Not a symbol she recognized, but one that suggested repetition, pattern, control. She paused briefly, running her fingers near the carving without touching it. Old. Intentional. Not part of the palace's main design language. That meant it had been added later. Hidden within the structure rather than built with it. A modification, not an original feature. Her attention sharpened. Someone had altered this part of the palace deliberately, and not recently. She continued forward. The corridor ended in a dead end. Or at least, it appeared to. A solid wall of stone stood before her, seamless at first glance, unbroken by doors or windows. But she didn't stop. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes scanning the surface slowly, deliberately. There. A faint irregularity in the stonework near waist height, a subtle shift in texture that broke the illusion of uniform construction. She crouched slightly, studying it. Pressure point, not visible, designed to blend in. She pressed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, almost reluctant sound, something inside the wall shifted. Stone slid against stone, not outward, but inward, and a narrow seam appeared where none had been before, a hidden mechanism. The wall didn't open fully. It parted just enough to reveal darkness beyond. Cold. Still. Waiting. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping inside. The air changed immediately. Heavier. Older. The kind of air that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The narrow passage beyond was unlit, forcing her to rely on instinct and memory rather than sight. But she didn't slow. She adapted. That was what she did best. The passage sloped downward slightly, spiraling deeper into the structure of the palace. With every step, the sense of isolation grew stronger, as if the world above was being sealed further and further away. Eventually, faint light appeared ahead. Not torchlight. Something colder. More controlled. She followed it. The passage opened into a chamber that did not belong in any palace designed for public power. The space was circular, carved deep into the foundation of the structure. The walls were lined with shelves, not of decoration, but of records. Scrolls, stone tablets, sealed documents stored with unnatural precision. At the center of the room stood a table, and above it, suspended from iron fixtures, were maps. Not of territory in the traditional sense, these maps showed movement, routes, patterns, trade lines, patrol schedules, names written in margins that connected people across regions in ways that suggested something far more organized than simple governance. This was not a storage room. It was an archive, a hidden one. Her breath slowed as she stepped further inside, her gaze scanning the contents with growing focus. This was not accidental secrecy. This was structured concealment. Whoever controlled this space had gone to great lengths to ensure it remained unknown, and which meant its contents were not just sensitive, they were dangerous. She moved closer to the table at the center, careful not to disturb anything. On its surface lay several open documents, their edges worn, their ink slightly faded but still legible. Names, dates, locations, patterns of movement between territories that should not have been connected. Her eyes tracked them quickly, absorbing details, building connections. And then she saw it. A repeated designation, not a name, a code. It appeared across multiple documents, linked to different regions, different events, different individuals, always present, always connected, always marked in the same subtle way. Her fingers hovered just above the paper, not touching it. Something about it felt wrong in a way she couldn't immediately define, not dangerous in the obvious sense. Dangerous in the structural sense, like a foundation built incorrectly but hidden so well that the collapse hadn't yet happened. Yet. She moved to another section of the room. This one contained sealed containers, thin metallic cases stacked neatly along a shelf. One of them had been opened recently. The seal was broken, the contents missing. That detail mattered more than the rest, because whatever had been inside was no longer here. Someone had removed it, recently enough for the absence to still feel fresh. She straightened slowly, her mind already working through implications. This wasn't just information storage, it was active management. Someone was not only recording events, they were shaping them, directing them, controlling how power moved through the region like threads in a web, and the Alpha Kingdom was part of that web. A faint sound behind her made her freeze, not loud, not sudden, just enough. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she listened, measured. Nothing followed, no footsteps, no shift in air. But she knew better than to trust silence here. Slowly, she stepped away from the table, positioning herself where she could see multiple angles of the chamber at once. Her body remained relaxed, but every sense sharpened. This place was not meant to be discovered, which meant discovery had consequences. She moved toward the far wall, where the maps hung in layered complexity. Up close, the details became clearer. Lines connecting territories that should not have intersected. Markings indicating resource shifts that did not match public records. And beneath it all, something even more unsettling, a pattern of timing. Events that seemed unrelated at first glance, but when placed together, formed a rhythm, a schedule. Someone wasn't just recording history, they were organizing it, shaping it, predicting it, or worse, creating it. Her pulse tightened slightly. This was bigger than infiltration, bigger than political tension. This was systemic and deeply rooted. The sound came again, closer this time, still subtle but no longer ambiguous. She shifted slightly, positioning herself behind one of the shelves, just as a faint movement appeared at the edge of the chamber entrance. A shadow, then another. Not guards, not servants. Something more deliberate, more careful. Whoever they were, they moved like people who expected silence, not resistance. She held still, watched, waited. One of them stepped fully into the chamber. A hooded figure, face obscured, posture calm but alert. They didn't immediately notice her. Their attention went straight to the table, to the documents. A second figure followed, then a third. They began speaking in low tones, too quiet to fully catch. But the structure of their conversation was clear enough. Disagreement, planning, adjustment. They were not surprised to find the room accessed. They were managing the breach, which meant this wasn't their first time dealing with intrusion, which meant she might not be the first outsider to find this place. The realization settled slowly, carefully. She shifted slightly, just enough to gain a clearer angle. One of the figures placed something on the table, another document, or perhaps a replacement for something removed. Their movements were practiced, efficient, like this was routine. Like this chamber was part of an ongoing system rather than a hidden secret. And that changed everything, because secrets are one thing, systems are another entirely. One of the figures paused, their head turned slightly as if sensing something. Not seeing, sensing. Her body tensed instinctively, preparing to move, but before she could decide direction, a new thought cut through her focus like a blade. If this was a system, then the Alpha King's awareness earlier wasn't coincidence. It was recognition. He wasn't reacting to her defiance. He was reacting to her proximity to something already in motion, something he knew about, something she had just stepped directly into. The figure turned further. She shifted her weight subtly, preparing to disappear into the shadows if needed. And in that suspended moment, between detection and escape, she understood the truth forming beneath everything she had seen so far. The palace was not hiding secrets. It was maintaining them. And she had just entered the control room of a conspiracy far larger than anything she had been sent to investigate. The moment she left the hidden chamber, she already knew something had changed, not in the obvious way of alarms or pursuit, but in the quieter, more dangerous way that only came when the world itself began to adjust its posture around you. The palace did not feel the same as she retraced her steps through the narrow passage, the stone walls seeming closer, the air slightly heavier, as if the structure had become aware of her presence in a way it had not been before. That was the problem with places built on secrets. They did not remain passive once touched. They reacted. She moved quickly now, but still controlled, never rushing in a way that would betray urgency. Her mind replayed the chamber again and again, the maps, the coded markings, the organized patterns of influence stretching far beyond the palace walls. It was no longer just a theory. It was structure, system, intent. And systems like that did not allow outsiders to observe them without consequence. She reached the concealed exit point, pressing the same hidden mechanism in reverse. The stone shifted with a reluctant grind, sealing the passage behind her. For a brief moment she stood still in the corridor, listening. Nothing followed immediately, no footsteps, no voices. But silence here was no longer reassurance. It was preparation. She exhaled slowly and began moving again, retracing her route toward the guest wing, recalibrating her thoughts as she walked. She needed to process what she had seen, but more importantly, she needed to decide what to do with it. Information alone was dangerous. Information without protection was fatal. And she had just gathered enough to put herself at the center of something that clearly did not tolerate interference. That was when she heard it. Not behind her. Ahead. A shift in rhythm. Footsteps that did not belong to palace guards or servants. She slowed immediately, stepping into the shadow of a pillar as instinct took over before thought. 3 figures emerged from the far end of the corridor, moving with quiet purpose. Not rushing, not patrolling, searching. That difference mattered. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched them. One of them was familiar. That alone tightened something in her chest. A man from earlier in the court gathering. Not one of the loud ones. Not one of the obvious predators. The quiet observer type. The kind who asked questions without speaking and remembered answers without acknowledging them. He had spoken to her briefly, offered warnings disguised as politeness. Now he was here, not by coincidence. That realization settled in slowly, unpleasantly. The trio stopped near an intersection ahead, speaking in low tones she could not fully hear, but their body language was clear enough. Searching patterns, coordinated movement, purposeful containment. They were not wandering. They were narrowing space. She shifted slightly deeper into the shadow, her back pressed lightly against the stone, calculating distance, exits, timing. Then the familiar man turned his head slightly and looked directly at her. Not past her, not around her, at her. The recognition was instant, controlled, and absolute. "There," he said quietly, not raising his voice but not needing to. The other two reacted immediately, adjusting their direction with trained efficiency. No hesitation, no confusion. So it was already decided. She was the target. The betrayal did not arrive with emotion. It arrived with clarity. She had trusted no one here fully, but she had allowed for degrees of neutrality. He had occupied that space. That was the mistake. She moved. Not backward, forward. Because retreat would narrow options. Forward expanded them. The corridor ahead curved slightly, offering a brief break in line of sight. She used it, accelerating just enough to break visual tracking without drawing attention from distant patrols. Behind her, footsteps followed. Controlled pursuit. Not chaotic, not panicked, professional. Which meant this was not spontaneous discovery. It was coordinated, planned. She turned sharply into a side passage, one she had noted earlier as minimally used. Her hand brushed the wall as she moved, counting steps, mapping mentally. The palace layout was becoming familiar now in a way that was almost instinctive, but familiarity did not guarantee safety. It only made prediction possible, and prediction worked both ways. She reached a junction and paused just long enough to listen. The footsteps split. Two continued straight. One adjusted direction. She was being boxed. That confirmed it. They knew her movement patterns. Or they were guessing well enough to simulate knowing. Either way, the result was the same. She was being herded. And in that meant escape alone was no longer the optimal outcome. A decision formed quickly in her mind. Not escape. Redirect. She moved again, deliberately this time, allowing a slight trace of sound, just enough to bait attention, then cut into a narrower passage that led upward. The stairs here were older, less maintained, used mostly for service movement between upper balconies and restricted observation points. As she climbed, she felt the air shift again, becoming thinner, colder. The palace architecture changed subtly in these older sections, less polished, more functional. That was useful. Function meant structure. Structure meant predictability. She reached a landing and stopped just long enough to assess. Below, movement continued. They were still tracking, but now with uncertainty. Good. Uncertainty slowed precision. She moved along the upper corridor, keeping close to the wall, until she reached a partially open archway overlooking a lower courtyard. And there, she saw him. The Alpha King. He stood alone at the center of a small inner courtyard, illuminated by pale moonlight filtering through high latticework above. He was not accompanied, not guarded in the visible sense, but everything about the space around him suggested otherwise. The air itself felt controlled, measured, and he was speaking to someone. A single figure stood opposite him, partially obscured by shadow. The same quiet man. The one who had just betrayed her. Her pulse slowed, not from fear, but recognition of scale. This was not pursuit. This was convergence. She remained still, observing. The distance was enough that she could not hear every word clearly, but fragments reached her through the open arch. "Interference confirmed," the man said, his tone no longer casual. It was procedural, report-like. She accessed the lower archive. The Alpha King did not react immediately. That silence was more telling than any immediate response. Then he spoke, voice low, controlled. "And you let her leave the chamber?" The man hesitated. Just slightly. That hesitation was enough. "We contained the exits," he said. "We assumed she would return to her quarters." A pause. She did not follow expected patterns. A faint shift in the Alpha King's posture. Not anger. Something closer to assessment. "Of course she didn't," he said quietly. The words carried no judgment, only understanding. That alone made her stomach tighten slightly, because it meant he had expected deviation. Or worse, he had planned for it. The man continued. "Protocol suggests elimination or containment before further dissemination." That word, elimination, landed differently in the silence, heavy, final. The Alpha King turned slightly, gaze lifting toward the upper levels of the palace, not directly at her, but close enough that instinct made her body still. "Protocol," he repeated softly, almost thoughtfully. Then, after a pause, "No." One word. Simple. Absolute. The man stiffened slightly. "My king?" "She stays," he interrupted. Calm, final. No room for argument. The silence that followed was sharp enough to feel physical. The man hesitated again, and in that hesitation, something subtle shifted in the dynamic. Control was not where it had been a moment ago. "She saw too much," the man said carefully. "Then she understands more than you do," the Alpha King replied. That answer changed everything. Because it was not dismissal, it was acknowledgement. She exhaled slowly, barely audible even to herself. This was not protection. Not yet. This was calculation, and she was part of it. The betrayal clicked into place fully now. The man was not rogue. He was not acting independently. He was executing a branch of an existing system, and she had just been classified as a variable within that system. The Alpha King stepped slightly forward in the courtyard, his gaze lifting again, not toward the arch, but somewhere beyond it. "She is not to be removed," he said quietly. "She is to be observed." A pause, then, colder. "And brought to me when she makes her next move." Her next move, so he already anticipated motion. That meant he understood intent, or at least believed he did. The man gave a slight bow, though reluctance lingered in the movement. "As you command." He turned and left. The courtyard fell into silence again, but it was no longer empty silence. It was structured silence. She remained still for several seconds longer, processing the shift. Betrayal had been confirmed. But it was not isolated, it was operational. That meant she was no longer outside the system. She was inside it. The question now was not how to escape. It was how to navigate being inside something that had already accounted for her presence. A slow movement caught her attention below. The Alpha King tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the visible space. Then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze shifted upward again, not directly, but close enough that she felt the alignment. He knew she was near. Not exactly where, but near enough to matter. That realization changed the air in her lungs, because it meant the strategic window was closing. She stepped back from the archway slowly, retreating into shadow before any additional observation could confirm her position. Her mind worked quickly now, restructuring everything she knew. Betrayal had not destabilized her. It had clarified the rules. She was not being hunted randomly. She was being positioned, which meant there was still room to reposition herself. As she moved away from the courtyard, she made a decision that felt less like choice and more like necessity. If the Alpha King was already observing her as part of a system, then she needed proximity to that system, not escape from it. And that meant something far more dangerous than avoidance. And it meant engagement. Controlled, calculated, strategic, but engagement nonetheless. Somewhere behind her, the palace continued its quiet operations, unaware that the structure of trust within it had already begun to fracture. Or perhaps aware, and simply adjusting accordingly. Either way, she understood now that she was no longer just infiltrating a kingdom. She was entangled in its machinery, and the only way forward was through it. The night the palace finally broke, it did not announce itself with chaos. It began with stillness so precise it felt engineered. Even the wind outside the highest towers seemed to hesitate, as if the world itself was waiting for permission to continue. She stood at the edge of the inner hall balcony, unseen among carved stone arches that overlooked the central court where everything would converge. To below her, the palace was alive in a different way now, not with celebration, not with ceremony, but with anticipation sharpened into something dangerous. Guards moved with sharper coordination. Nobles no longer pretended at ease. The hidden systems she had uncovered were no longer hidden in practice. They were active, shifting, responding to pressure points she had already disturbed. She had expected retaliation. What she had not expected was timing this precise, because everything was aligned. Every corridor she had studied, every pattern she had decoded, every betrayal she had confirmed, it all funneled toward this moment. And at the center of it, as always now, was him. The Alpha King stood below in the central court, not on his throne, not elevated, but on the ground where the structure of authority could no longer be mistaken for distance. Around him, the assembled alphas had gathered under formal summons that no one had dared refuse. Their presence filled the space like a tightening coil, each one aware that this was not a normal council. Something had shifted, something irreversible. She watched from above, her presence concealed not by magic or illusion, but by architecture and timing, two things she had learned to exploit far better than deception. Her heart was steady, but not calm. Calm implied ignorance. She had none of that left. Below, voices rose and fell in controlled exchange, accusations disguised as discussion, concerns framed as loyalty. But beneath all of it, tension bled through the cracks. The system she had glimpsed beneath the palace was no longer theoretical. It was collapsing under its own exposure, and they all knew it. A figure stepped forward in the circle below, the same man who had betrayed her earlier. His posture was different now, less confident, more rigid. Unauthorized breach of the lower archive has been confirmed, he announced, voice echoing against stone. Multiple protocols have been compromised. A ripple passed through the gathered alphas. Not surprise, confirmation. They had been waiting for this admission. The Alpha King did not react immediately. He stood at the center of it all like a fixed point in motion, watching the reactions rather than participating in them. That was what made him more dangerous than the rest. He did not need to raise his voice to control the room. He only needed to observe long enough for others to reveal themselves. And yet, she is still alive, one of the alphas said sharply. That alone is failure. Murmurs followed. Agreement. Discontent. Fear disguised as logic. The betrayed man glanced toward the king briefly, as if seeking instruction. She was to be contained, he said, but interference. There was no interference, the Alpha King interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it cut through everything. The room stilled. Even the smallest movements ceased. He turned slightly, scanning the circle of gathered power. There was observation, he corrected. There is a difference. That difference landed heavily. She felt it even from above. because it confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was not a mistake in their system. She was part of its test, or its recalibration. One of the elders stepped forward. "You allowed her access to restricted knowledge," he said, voice tightening. "You allowed deviation from protocol." The Alpha King finally turned fully toward him. "I allowed exposure," he said simply, "because concealment was no longer viable." A pause, then colder. "You all built a system that assumes ignorance as stability. That was your error." The tension snapped tighter. The air itself felt compressed. She watched carefully, every detail sharpening in her mind. This was no longer just political fracture. This was structural collapse of belief, and they were realizing it too late. The betrayed man stepped forward again, urgency breaking through his restraint. "She is outside now," he said quickly. "If she has reached the upper vantage points." The Alpha King's gaze shifted upward, not directly to her, but close enough that instinct tightened in her chest. "She has," he said. The acknowledgement was immediate, calm, absolute. Silence followed that statement in a way that was heavier than any reaction could have been. Slowly, he raised his voice. Not loud, but enough to carry beyond the circle, beyond the court, into the architecture itself. "You have seen enough," he said. "You are not hidden." There was no need for him to specify who he was addressing. The words were aimed precisely at her. The decision she had anticipated but never fully trusted now crystallized. She stepped forward from the shadowed archway above, revealing herself fully for the first time since this began. The movement below shifted instantly. Heads turned, bodies adjusted. The room reacted like a single organism recognizing a known variable entering its final state. She descended slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, every step deliberate, measured, controlled. By the time she reached the lower floor, the circle had widened slightly, unconsciously creating space for confrontation. She stopped a few paces from the edge of it, meeting the Alpha King's gaze directly. No submission, no defiance, just alignment, recognition. "So this is the moment," she said quietly. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "It has been for you longer than you think." That was not accusation. It was acknowledgement of parallel awareness. Around them, the others shifted uneasily, unsure how to interpret the exchange. The betrayed man stepped forward again, more desperate now. "She has accessed classified structures. She understands too much to remain uncontained." The Alpha King did not look at him. "She understands exactly what I intended her to," he said. That sentence fractured the remaining certainty in the room. Her gaze narrowed slightly. "You guided me there," she said, not a question. He did not deny it. "You were already moving toward it," he replied. "I only ensured you did not stop short." The realization spread through her slowly, not as shock, but as confirmation of something she had refused to fully accept. The mission had never been infiltration alone. It had been testing exposure thresholds. She had been placed into a system already under observation, not to be eliminated, but to reveal what resisted stability. And she had done exactly that. "You used me," she said quietly. "As a diagnostic," he corrected. The difference mattered to him. She could hear it in the precision. That was what made him different from the others. Not cruelty, not ambition, structure, intentionality. "And what did you find?" she asked. The question hung in the air longer than any before it. He stepped closer, not threatening, not retreating, closing distance. "That my system had blind assumptions," he said, "and that you exposed them faster than any controlled variable would have allowed." A faint ripple of unease passed through the gathered alphas. They were no longer participants. They were witnesses to recalibration. The betrayal had not been hers alone. It had been systemic. The man who had tried to contain her now, realized he had been part of something larger that he no longer controlled. "Then what am I now?" she asked. The Alpha King regarded her with an expression that had shifted subtly since their first encounter. Less observation now. More recognition. "A variable that has completed its function," he said. A pause. "And therefore no longer one." The meaning was not dismissal. It was transition. She understood it immediately. She was no longer classified as threat or anomaly. She had become something integrated into understanding. That should have meant removal. Instead, it meant evolution. Around them, the system she had uncovered was no longer resisting exposure. It was absorbing it, reconfiguring, adapting. The betrayed man stepped back, realizing too late that the structure he had enforced no longer supported his position. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. The Alpha King finally looked away from the gathered circle and directly at her. "Now," he said, "you decide whether you remain outside the system or become part of what replaces it." The weight of that statement settled between them like an unspoken shift in gravity. Not coercion, not threat. Invitation shaped by inevitability. For the first time since entering the palace, she felt something other than calculated survival guiding her response. Not trust, not submission. Recognition of alignment in contradiction. The system she had fought was not static. It was transforming. And she had already become part of its transformation whether she accepted it or not. Slowly, the tension in the room began to dissolve, not into peace, but into restructuring. The confrontation was not ending in destruction, it was ending in redefinition. She exhaled once, controlled. "And if I refuse?" she asked. And the Alpha King's expression shifted slightly, not colder, not warmer, clearer. "Then you remain exactly what you have always been," he said. "Outside." A pause. "But you already know what exists outside systems like this." She did. Isolation, observation, endless repetition of conflict without resolution. She looked at him for a long moment. Then quietly, she said, "I didn't come here to belong." "Neither did I," he replied. That was the final shift, not agreement, not alliance in the traditional sense, recognition of parallel structure. Around them, the gathered alphas no longer mattered in the same way. Power had redistributed without violence. Authority had recalibrated without declaration. She stepped slightly closer, closing the remaining distance. Not submission, not defiance, choice. "Then we understand each other," she said. Yes, a faint pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his head. Not as a king to a subject, but as one strategist acknowledging another. The confrontation did not end with victory or defeat. It ended with clarity. And in that clarity, something new began forming, unstable, untested, and entirely aware of itself. Above them, the palace remained silent. But it was no longer the same silence that had opened this night. It was the silence after change had already occurred. And somewhere deep within its structure, the system continued adjusting to the fact that neither of them could be categorized cleanly anymore. As she finally turned slightly, looking away from the circle of watching alphas and toward the exit of the hall, a final thought formed, not as resolution, but as continuation. Because the real question was no longer who had power, and it was what power would become when it could no longer rely on certainty. And as she walked beside the Alpha King into the uncertain space beyond the court, she realized the answer was not waiting to be discovered. It was already being written.